Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great.
You can still breathe.
You want it where my introduction, you want to take the microphone?
We can do that, yeah. And
It'll
then,
get cleaner audio.
okay, perfect. Yeah, we can do that. So,
Oh, great. I will take that.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start.
If you don't mind, I'll take the water.
Absolutely. Okay. Ashley, you ready? Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Mark Gray. I'm head of the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology here at UNI. And I welcome you all to this very special evening. I want to remind everybody that this evening's SAC Department Diversity Colloquium is co-sponsored by the Office of the President. In particular, you can thank them for all the wonderful cookies you're going to eat on the way back out, so we don't eat them in the department tomorrow morning. Eat more treats. That's our mantra here. Before I hand it over to my friend and colleague to introduce our special guest, I want to remind you that in this colloquium series, our next event is going to be Wednesday, the 20th of October, here in the Scholar Space over in Rod Library. And our special guest is going to be Mr. Gary Nachman, who is the Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League, and he will be coming to campus to talk about the rise in hate crimes in Iowa and the Midwest. So put that on your calendar, 7 o'clock, 20th of October, here on campus. To introduce our special guest tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and dear colleague, Assistant Professor of Sociology, Professor Ashley Kaiser Moon. Ashley?
all right. So, good evening. On behalf of the Sociology, Anthropology, and Criminology Department at the University of Northern Iowa, I'd like to welcome you to our Diversity Colloquium. I have the honor of introducing our esteemed guest, Miss Betty Andrews, but before I do that, I want to also thank a few folks that helped make tonight's event possible. So in addition to the President's Office and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, I'd like to thank both Dr. Mark Gray and my other collaborator for this series, Dr. Cameron Warren, for their help in organizing tonight's event. I also want to thank our colleagues across campus who encouraged their students to attend tonight's event. So thank you for those of you that came in person, as well as those of you that are joining virtually. And then finally, I'd like to acknowledge that while we gather here at the University of Northern Iowa, this campus is on traditional Indigenous land. Cedar Falls, Iowa is located on Iowa Sauk and Meskwaki, Wahpeton, and Ochoochee-Sakowin lands. So without further ado, tonight we welcome Miss Betty C. Andrews and look forward to her presentation on Fighting Forward, Combating the Attack on Voting Rights. Miss Andrews is noted as one of Iowa's most acclaimed leaders, and through her commitment to excellence has built a reputation as a brilliant businesswoman, a powerful civil rights leader and social justice activist, and a strong proponent of connecting people around strategic engagement, culture, history, and arts. Ms. Andrews finds tremendous fulfillment in success in creating, organizing, and promoting opportunities that build community. She is president and CEO of Betty Andrews Media, a media events and strategic communication firm where I'll Make Me a World in Iowa, Iowa's African American Festival, is one of her key clients. Andrews serves as president of the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP State Area Conference of Branches, where she leads over 30 units of the National Association. Ms. Andrews is the founder of the Iowa Summit and Justice Disparities, a change initiative that addresses disproportionality in Iowa's criminal justice and other systems. Betty is also a parliamentarian and registered lobbyist. She lives by her business tagline and personal motto, leave 'em saying wow. So please join me in giving Miss Andrews a warm UNI welcome.
I do have one question. Where am I changing the screen?
So you can just click.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you.
so much. All right. Well, good evening, UNI. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be. Oh, I need to do the mic. All right. Good evening, you and I. I appreciate the opportunity to be before you this evening. I see some familiar faces actually in the audience, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I'll be talking about a few people from the area a little bit later that I am friends with and thought I'd mention because they're doing great work in this community as well. So again, I do want to thank you, Dr. Gray. And thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you to also the President's Office that is co-sponsoring this event. As was mentioned, let's see, get this. My title this evening, it's kind of ironic because our national theme for the NAACP is Fighting Forward. So when I was asked to speak on the subject of combating the attack on voting rights, it was perfect. So fighting forward, so we're gonna be taught. So if I come out swinging, that's okay, right? I don't know that I'll come out swinging, but I did want to just give you a little bit of a warning. I did also want to thank the University of Northern Iowa also for sponsoring I'll Make Me a World in Iowa. As was mentioned earlier, it's Iowa's African American Festival, happens in Des Moines each year. We are going on 24 years old, and the University of Northern Iowa has always been a great sponsor, and not only a sponsor, but also has hands-on worked with us, and so we appreciate that. Whew. A say-so. On August 5th, 2020, Governor Kim Reynolds signed Executive Order number 7. Executive Order number 7 allows those who have served time for a felony, those that have a felony record and have completed their time and their probation and parole, to vote. This is not the first time this has happened. It happened a few years ago with Governor Vilsack. But I will say that after Governor Branstad's cancellation of the policy, it was a hard fight to make it happen again. Right around that time, I sat in a webinar and I was listening to a young man who was formerly incarcerated, and he was talking about his right to vote. And he put it like this: I just want a say-so. A say-so. He said, I have served my time, I have paid my fines, I have done everything that was asked of me, and now I just want to say so. He said, I want to say so for my children. I want to say so for my family. I just want to say so. I don't need to do everything. And he pointed to his fellow, his brothers that were there with him who had similar backgrounds. He said, we just want to say so. We have to pay. We're expected to do things that we're expected to adhere to the laws and the rules, but we just need to say so. And when I think about voting, I think about a say-so. I thought that was more eloquent than the most eloquent speaker, just to say, I'd like to have a say-so. And that's exactly what we're talking about today when we're talking about voting. Let me start by talking a little bit about the NAACP. I always assume that people are very familiar with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, but it's not always a good idea to assume. So I just wanted to just give you just briefly the mission of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And we're called the NAACP. And that mission is to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights for all persons and to eliminate race-based discrimination. And that's what we do, or we attempt to do. And the way that we attempt to do that is through areas that we call our game changers. And those areas include health. Just in case you didn't know, we're in a pandemic. And one thing you also might know is that as African Americans have experienced the pandemic in great disparate numbers. And I know this is the Cedar Valley, Waterloo area. I work a lot in Waterloo, and I'm very familiar with all of the challenges that were there with the meatpacking plants and some of the other issues with COVID. So health, education, of course, we want to make sure that there is a free quality public education for all students. Economic development, African Americans have about 1/10 the wealth of white people. Public safety and criminal justice. This is a big one for me. Public safety and criminal justice. This is a big one for our nation in 2020. I know it's 2021, but in 2020, in 1985, in 2003, in 2007, in 2021, criminal justice and criminal justice issues, they symbolize the tip of the iceberg. And so we have worked very hard in the areas of criminal justice and moving the ball in that area. And then, of course, there's political action. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we're discussing voting rights today. And then youth engagement. We all want to see our legacies continue, and we want to make sure that our young people are aware of everything that is happening, and that we bridge the gap from the history of the past that is so important to what is going to be happening in the future. And we want to make sure that we bridge that gap. I think I'm missing a slide here, but I also wanted to just acknowledge that the NAACP started about 112 years ago in 1909. We started with an anti-lynching campaign. And a lot of times people think about the NAACP as a black organization. Well, the truth is that the clarion call for the NAACP came from a white lady, Mary White Ovington. And a lot of people are not aware of that. There was a previous meeting, the Niagara Movement, but it was Mary White Ovington that gave the clarion call to start the NAACP. Many of you know us from famous acts like working with Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the landmark education civil rights lawsuit that desegregated schools. And then, of course, our work with the Voters' Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, I mentioned criminal justice. And then we have been a voice for civil rights and social justice for over 112 years. So we didn't just come on the scene. And I like to remind people of that because I know that a lot of people became woke last year, and that's an awesome thing. We want people to be woke. We want people to understand these issues, to understand the justice issues, to make sure that they are contending, making those commitments. We want that. But we also know that there has been a legacy and a history, and we are a part of that legacy and history. We're known as the oldest civil rights organization, and they say that we are the baddest, the boldest, and I'm going to mess the rest of it, but it's the most discussed, the most cussed, et cetera, civil rights organization in the world. So, and we're proud to be known as the baddest and the boldest. This is where I'm missing a slide. I do want to acknowledge that we have Waterloo and Black Hawk County. We do have an NAACP that is here locally. I mentioned kind of the Brown versus the Board of Education, but I am the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP president. So what that means is that there are about 30 units of the organization that I preside over in these two states, and we work on a number of initiatives. We work on legislation at the state level. We are big right now. One of our big pushes is for anti-racial profiling legislation, but we're also working in cities, and we've gotten some ordinances passed on anti-racial profiling. We also work with Ban the Box. I know that the city of Waterloo recently had a lawsuit on Ban the Box. We are proud to say that we offered an amicus brief in that lawsuit, and that lawsuit was actually won in the Supreme Court based on the tenets that the NAACP offered. So we do a lot of legal work around this. And then, of course, as lobbyists, we are there on Capitol Hill. We were there fighting against the voter suppression law. We were there fighting against the critical race theory that they say is not critical race theory law that has been passed. We were there. So we are there. Our goal is to fight. We work with a number of organizations on that. I see Mr. Hayes back there, and I know he's doing a lot of work in this area. We work with a number of organizations in all of the facets. You remember I mentioned the Game Changers. So we're out there. And then on the other side, we do things like offering housing grants and health grants and helping people get registered and et cetera, making sure. I just also, though, wanted to take a moment and just acknowledge from this area, Mayor Hart, and all the hard work that he's doing. It's not easy being the first Black anything. You know, a lot of times there's a reason we celebrate that. So being the first Black mayor, I know that he's gone through a lot, and he's a good friend of mine. I just wanted to acknowledge him. Roz Smith, who is the representative from this area, and I know he's doing a lot of work, and very proud of him for putting in place and asking me to be a partner in ensuing the More Perfect Union law that was passed last year, and which was one of the big things that did come out of 2020. So we're grateful for him. We know that he's has a bid for the governor's office. And then I just want to also acknowledge Chief Joel Fitzgerald again. It is not easy being the first Black anything. It is detrimental to your health, stress-wise. And so what he is taking on is amazing, and I just want you all to know that we see him, and then it is challenged. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the awesome Miss Anna Mae Weems, but I just had to give her a shout out. She's a former NAACP president. And then also Miss Nikole Hannah-Jones. How can we not acknowledge a fellow Iowan who, okay, so I know this is the University of Northern Iowa, but can I just be real for a moment here? She's the baddest chick. I mean, she's the baddest chick. When you think about a woman that set forth a curriculum, a way to write history, to educate people, to put something out there. And it scared people so much that they had to try to throw laws at it. They even made up this thing called critical race theory. I know it wasn't really made up, but when I say made up, it was a very obscure theory that nobody even knew about. So they propagandized it and then started throwing things at it. And so I salute Nikole Hannah-Jones just for her work. And I know a lot of people say, well, it's about the truth, making sure that history is true and all of that. And I giggle at that because I know growing up, I mean, I don't believe George Washington never told a lie. You guys really believe that Christopher Columbus discovered America? I mean, history. And not only that, from one vantage point, history. So they were telling the vantage point of the white slave owners, et cetera, and it was one vantage point. And so when I look at someone who comes with a more in-depth piece of history or take on history, I appreciate it. And I just say kudos to her because she's the baddest chick. And I also know she's doing some freedom schools here locally, so I commend her for that. Did want to mention that the Iowa Summit on Justice and Disparities, I know at least one person in the room has attended a few times regularly. And that happens every year in either October or November. We hold it in Ankeny, so the Des Moines area, and it's an opportunity to address disparities in our criminal justice system. Did you all know that for a couple of decades, Iowa ranked #1 in over-incarcerating African Americans? So we're now down to #3, nothing to celebrate. But here's the bad thing. We're now up to #1, or I don't even know if we left it, for incarcerating juveniles. So we need to have a place where we bring together judges and law enforcement and legislators, et cetera, to have this kind of conversation about disparities. All right, let's talk about voting. National Voter Registration Day. You all knew that, right? Today's National Voter Registration Day. Really important. I thought I'd start by talking about just the fact that it is, and it's not too late to check your voter registration status, to call your senators, and to demand that they protect voting rights for all. H.R. 1, H.R. 4, I think it is. The For the People Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Act. And then also sending voting registration to 5 people. You can certainly get voting registration information from the Secretary of State's office. Their website is doing really well. We know because the NAACP worked with them to make sure that it was doing well. So proud of that. So let's talk about why voting is important. Anybody have any thoughts? Why is voting? Okay, so look. My tradition is the Black church, so we believe in having some talk back. I know I'm on YouTube, but if you have talk back, I can certainly repeat what you said. So, anybody have any sense of why voting is important? Yes, ma'am.
Our government is set up to be represented, like we have a representative democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So meaning that we elect people with our ideals and who we think would do a good job at voicing our concerns.
Right. So we're both the democracy and a republic. Yes, and we elect our representatives. Absolutely.
I think it's important because through time, not everybody has had the option to vote and bring their ideas and have a part in making decisions. So everybody who does have that option should use it because I think sometimes we forget that hasn't always been an option for everybody or an opportunity for everybody.
Right. It has not always been an opportunity for everybody. That is so true. Anybody else? I need one more. Come on. It translates political voice and political will into action. And to all of those things, I'll say, that's what I was going to say. Representation, and again, my favorite one is having a say-so. You're able, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but don't take my word for it. Let's check out some quotes from a few people. Voting is not only our right, it's our power. When we vote, we take back our power to choose, to speak up, and to stand with those who support us. And Luong Ung is a Cambodian human rights activist and lecturer. And then this one, if your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't be trying so hard to keep you from voting. Now, I've heard this in various ways, and that was from Common. You all know Common, right? Grammy Award-winning Common. And then, of course, our Dr. King quote, Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And that's important because our vote is our voice. And it's our voice, and that's why it's such a travesty when people step on those rights and prevent others from having those rights. So let's, when you talk about voting, and you were talking about a representative democracy, it's really true. When you vote, you have a say-so. I'm going to use that, have a say-so, but you have a say-so in who represents you. And that matters because it matters for your life. And from the federal government, we elect our president, our senators, our Congress people. And for our state government, we elect the governors, the senators, the representatives. And these things matter. And we'll talk a little bit more about why they matter on the next page. And of course, at the local level, the mayor and city council, county officials, school board members, sheriffs, even the dog catcher. All of those things matter in your life. And someone said political will. And when I think about politics, and a lot of people say, oh, I don't do politics. No politics. I don't do politics. That's over my head, or that's too much. But when you think about, first of all, being able to select your representatives, try to get people who are thinking like you to represent you. It's extremely important. And just in case you don't do politics, do you do taxes? Do you have local schools? What about Social Security? Public safety? We just talked about criminal justice. Prisons, and even voting can affect how you vote. What about health care? Armed service, tuition. Anybody affected by tuition? Don't do politics, huh? Even down to the leash law, like whether or not your dog needs to be on a leash, works through politics and voting and government. Your mortgage rates, foreign policy, economic development, how we deal with discrimination. There are different, the EEOC, the Department of Justice here in the state, the Iowa Civil Rights Commission. There's a Civil Rights Commission in this area and around the states. And then law enforcement. What about our sheriffs? Said criminal justice several times. I see I've got it here. I must have really been thinking about justice and criminal justice. Even your food additives. Even your food additives. You guys remember the debate about how big to make the drinks? And how that got so political? So your political right, or politics is important. When we think about the word politics, that's over people's head. But when we think about these tangible things, this is like everything, right? This is everything. Potholes. So this matters. And do you want to have a say-so in these types of things? Anybody? I could take the say-so. I would love to do that. but I think all of us need to have a say-so. Okay, so while we're thinking a little bit about voting history, and this is to your point earlier, that not everyone has always voted. This is a little bit about the history of voting. I'm not going to go too deep in it, but I wanted to just share that in the 1700s, voting was limited to white male property owners. I didn't put the male in there, but male property owners. 1800s. They say that the official voting, the barriers started to recede, like in 1870 with the 15th Amendment that allowed freedmen to vote. That allowed freedmen to vote. Wink, wink. Freedmen were black men that were formerly slaves. And I say wink, wink, because the reality was that most of them weren't allowed to vote for a number of other reasons. In 1920, women, through the 19th Amendment, won the right to vote. And then in the 1960s, and even before that, so the reason why I said the wink, wink, there were a number of barriers to voting that were put in places, like poll taxes. Anybody know what a poll tax is? So, and this pertains to, these are Jim Crow laws. This pertains specifically to black people, African Americans, former slaves, or descendants of slaves. Poll tax, and then also, let me also say, some poor whites. This also affected them. They would charge a tax to vote. So when you say that not everybody had the privilege to vote, absolutely true. So they would charge a tax to vote. And let's say the tax was $1. $1 is not a lot, right? Not a lot. But back then it was probably about $40. And not only would they charge that tax, they would say, well, not only do you have to pay for this election, but you have to pay for all the elections you missed. And why did they miss those elections? Because they weren't allowed to vote in those elections. So if you think about compounding $40, that's a lot to vote. And that's just, I mean, just one thing. They also did these tests. How many of you know how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Anybody? Well, that's how ridiculous some of the tests were. I have a friend, Shirley Harrington. She's from Mississippi. She was a young activist in the 1960s, 1950s. And she told me how they would, as black people approached to try to vote, how they would ask them to repeat the Constitution. Anybody can do that? But you know what? There were some African Americans that could do that because they actually set up schools and clinics and rehearsed it and went through and repeated the Constitution. But it certainly was not a good thing. It was not a tough time. I mean, it was a tough time. This was during the civil rights movement. And they also practiced intimidation, which included everything, you name it, lynching, death, attacks on families, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of opposition to black people voting. So again, at this time, officially, our African Americans had the right to vote, but they could not vote in many cases. So just kind of going through a little bit further, finally in 1964, we did have the 24th Amendment that eliminated poll taxes, we hope. And then, of course, the NAACP worked with Lyndon B. Johnson on the Voting Rights Act, and then also that passed Congress. And then I just wanted to point out in 1971, young people won the right to vote, which meant that at one point voting was 21 and over. In 1971, it became 18. Simply, people said, well, if I have to go to war, I should be able to vote. Makes sense. Oops. Okay. Okay. And just kind of moving things forward, because there were a number of other things that happened as well, some accommodations for people with disabilities, and then additional protections. But one of the things that happened was in June 2013, the Supreme Court struck down or struck a blow to like the meat of the Voters' Rights Act. And we still, to this day, continue to fight for that. That affects a lot of our southern states more than it does in Iowa, but it's still really important. Okay. And, oh, I'm going to skip all the way down to the yellow part, or almost down. Just acknowledging that 2019, preparing for the census and redistricting. By the way, we're in that process right now in Iowa, redistricting, which distributes or take a look at the population and redistributes the way people are allowed, or what districts people are allowed to vote in. The good thing is that we are a bipartisan process, so that's a good thing. We're hoping, but we're certainly, I know the NAACP is watching that process. And then also, in 2016, the presidential election claimed fraud. Of course, you all might have heard in 2020 that the presidential election had claims of fraud. And as some of the backlash from that, in 2021, state legislatures introduced over 400 bills to suppress the vote. Now, a number of them didn't pass, but I believe in like 17 states there have been voter suppression bills. And guess who is one of them? Iowa. Iowa is one of the states. I say we, our representatives passed Senate File 413. This was definitely a challenge because, and we'll just kind of go through a few of the things that it does. So it cuts back on the mail-in or the absentee voting and the time that you can request an absentee vote, an absentee ballot. So you have to really be mindful of the timing, and it also prohibits county auditors from assisting people in voting. So one of the things that I think county auditors, I know at least from the Lynn County area and maybe a few others, they actually sent out absentee ballots, and this law prohibits that. You have to request it or you cannot get an absentee ballot. These things make it harder to vote in Iowa. And then it cuts down from 29 days to 20 days, the period of time for early voting. Now, keep in mind, 4 years ago, there were 40 days of early voting. And now we're down to 20 days. So that's cut in half. And then, okay, so true story, true confessions. This one affected me. It says it closes the polls for elections an hour early. So I live in a suburb of Des Moines, and we were having a city council special election. And believe me, I advocated for this, against this law. I've educated people about this law and all of that. Yet, I waited until I think it was 9 o'clock. I waited until like 8:05, and I was like, oh, okay, I need to go vote. I get there, and everything is shut down. And I mean, it's just like 3 minutes away from my house. Everything is shut down. I missed that election. You know why? Because they cut that hour off. So it's really important that, and so I know if I miss the election, I know that other people miss that election too. So we really need to make sure that people are aware of that. And then also cutting down the time of that an employer allows for employees to vote. Now, if you're salaried, that may not affect you as much, but if you are a wage worker, and depending on how long the line is to vote, this could affect you. This could limit your opportunity to vote. So you really, so we contend that this is voter suppression. Senate File 413 also removes registered voters from the voter registration list if they missed, and I don't think it's just one. I think this might be, was early, but I know if you missed just a few elections, and I need to double check on that, your name will be dropped from the voter roll. And what's different about that is that if you registered in the past, your name would be there for until you come back to vote again 10 years later. But now you have to really be mindful. So people may have to re-register much more often, or people may show up thinking they're registered and they won't be registered because they missed some elections. And so that's important. And then the other thing that it does is, so this happens in church a lot. Say a mother in the church wanted one of the younger people to take their ballot in. This prohibits it from happening. You have to literally be a family member or a household member. You cannot take your neighbor's vote to the drop box or anything like that. Even if they allow you to do it, you cannot do that. So, yes.
I'm just curious, do you know, are there like places that people are holding that accountable? Like if someone drops it off at a checkpoint or like a drop box, how do they know that that law is being broken?
It's a really good question. I don't have the answer for that, but it's a good question. We should check into that. So it's a.
Like if they're concerned about the resources for it, I think they're shutting down an hour earlier. I just can only imagine the resources it would take to have somebody stand at a ballot box to double check and verify every person dropping a ballot.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. Really good point. We take good ideas like that. Thank you. You're okay. So what are we doing to combat it? Okay. So again, I mentioned that I'm a Christian, Black church tradition and that kind of thing. We have this thing in the Black church called Prayed Up. You guys familiar with Prayed Up? Prayed Up means, so Prayed Up means that if you are about to go into battle, spiritual battle, whatever battle, if you're about to take on something hard, you make sure that you're prayed up. Your relationship, that means you've got all your prayers in order, you've got your relationship with God is in order, and all of that. You're prayed up. You have put on whatever armor you feel you need to have. And I said the Christian faith, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the Christian faith. Any faith, they have a similar sayings to that. So making sure that you're prayed up. So making sure that you are equipped. And so when we're talking about combating this, we're thinking about what should be done. First of all, what should we be doing? What should we be prepared for? So prayed up is just preparation. Just as an FYI, in terms of some things that have been done so far, our friends, our Latino friends, LULAC, are you all familiar with LULAC? They're the, I'm going to mess it up, but they're kind of like the Latino NAACP, League of United Latin American Citizens. Thank you. See? I was on my way. Thank you, Dr. Gray. So they have filed a lawsuit, and I know that the NAACP, we've met with their attorneys, and we've actually met with our national office as well, kind of checking in on the lawsuit. And we know that we will be providing legal support. And as I mentioned earlier, our amicus brief game is really tight, so we're looking forward to helping with that. And then, of course, we will continue to advocate for voter rights both federally and locally. As the NAACP, our national president is always speaking federally. We have a full-time lobbyist in the Capitol and that are pushing very hard for H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, the For the People Act, and the John Lewis Voting Act, which essentially bring ethics into voting and campaign financing. We are also training our members and others around voting and making sure that they are supporting people getting registrations, we're also having voter registration drives all over. I was visiting with our Ames branch yesterday, and they have several sites in the city at one time that they're doing voter registration drives. And in the voter registration drives, they're also making sure that people understand these new rules. And that's what's important. So if you talk about being educated and armored and prepared, prayed up in the sense of being ready, that's what you want to do. You want to make sure that you are educated. This is how you combat it. I also like to remind people to make sure you don't forget about educating people about voting with a felony record. That's important because, let's see, I don't know if you knew that about 45,000 people have gotten their right to vote back with the executive order that the governor signed last year. But only about 5,000 of them are registered to vote. So there are a lot of people out there that have received their rights back but are not necessarily voting. And it's important that we make sure that they get that information. So this is something that's available through the NAACP, but we have a number of guides and things that we can provide that as well. And then I always just say, what can you do? How can you be prayed up, or how can you be ready to go? And it's not rocket science. Voting it's not rocket science, but it's really important. And sometimes if we miss things, it doesn't happen. And so one of my favorite sayings is action is magic. Action is magic. If you take action, something is going to happen, right? So obviously for the NAACP, we always push that people join the organization, but more importantly, join the work. And that work could be NAACP. We work a lot with the ACLU. There are a number of kind of ad hoc voting groups that come through. The League of Women's Voters is very strong. Are there any student organizations on campus that work with voting? Well, there should be. There may be. Okay. So we were talking about, possibly, if you'd like to talk with us about having a new chapter of the NAACP, or just having an organization that is their purpose, organizing around educating people about voting, educating students about voting. That's actually a place where sometimes we do have a lag in terms of making sure that young people are aware. And then, one of the other things is volunteering to market. So, a lot of people that are doing this work are kind of, aging out of the social media, or aged out of the social media world. So it would be very helpful if young people could help us with that. I say give a report or wear a T-shirt. Wear a T-shirt that says vote, register to vote, or just something like that sparks a conversation. Give a report. You have an assignment. My grandma used to say, use what you got. So if you're a filmmaker, if you're taking a film class, write a documentary about it. If you're a journalist, write an article about it. There are a number of the things that you can do. Any voting campaigns that you see, this is how we combat it. We get behind those campaigns. And then also, we talk to our elected officials and tell them to make voting easy. That is really important. So again, it's not magic, but it is magic, right? Because action is magic. Even today, voter registration, texting, is everybody here registered to vote? Raise your hand if you're registered to vote. Girlfriend, we got time. It's so important because we all need to have a say so. We all need to be a part of this, and it really does matter. And if you want, if you want your kids to have certain things at school, if you want, just like I said, your dog to have a dog park, that's what matters. So those are the things that you have to do, not magic, but very important, to combat this issue. And the other thing is making sure that every vote counts. And I'll leave you with that. You definitely want to, in addition to getting people registered, making sure that they go to the poll and make sure, and our role is to make sure that all the votes are counted. And we saw a lot of that in our last election. So I think that's it. So thank you. Thank you very much. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
How do you think the election mistrust within the 2020 election will affect the voter registration coming up?
Betty, could you repeat your question?
Absolutely. So the question was, how do you think that the voter mistrust or the election mistrust from 2020 will affect the vote going forward or registration going forward? Well, I think that obviously there are a lot of challenges with the integrity of the elections. And when I say that, I mean that there was a lot of push claiming that the elections were not accurate and things like that. And I think that those were misnomers, and that put people in awkward positions. But I absolutely think it will affect it. I had something in my head; it just went out my head. But I think it makes it all that more important that we fight with facts. And that means getting the word out about what actually did happen. This is what I was going to say. There were so many challenges and lawsuits and things like that, and all of them were struck down. And yet that push continues to rise, and we saw that on January 6th. And so it definitely is a challenge for us, but the best thing to do is to continue to fight to make sure that our democracy remains and make sure that people have the access to the polls. You're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How do we combat family intimidation? Because in our 2020 election, I know a lot of my friends, even though they could have lied about what they voted for because of what their family wanted for them and what other people around them wanted for them, they voted that way instead of voting for what they wanted.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So first of all, it's not uncommon for a younger person to kind of follow suit with their family until they get a little older. So I guess the thing that they got to know is that however they vote, that's their vote, whether they say it's their family that did it or not. And the good thing is that when you go to vote, you get to close that little curtain and do it on your own. And so there is, I would say, even them, you have to hold them accountable for their vote. So in the sense that, if you voted that way, you voted that way. It wasn't your mother, it wasn't your Aunt Susie, or whatever. But I think the most important thing is that whatever way they vote, is that they do vote. That's the most important thing. So, yes, sir.
So the numbers that you shared about eligible felons
Yes.
not registering to vote. So I'm wondering, is it just the education piece, or do you think that there are other barriers that are
Oh, yeah.
large, population that's missing representation?
Well, number one, so it's twofold. It's very new. There is, and I'll share another number with you too, because I'm very proud of this. It's very new. So there's a lot of question about what Executive Order number 7 actually did. And people don't know if they have to pay fines or fees. So that little flyer that I pulled up, some of the details include that a person does not have to pay their fines and fees. They have to just be off paper, off parole, off probation. And that's one thing. So people just don't know the fine details, and part of our work is getting that information out. Also, it's, you know, if you are incarcerated and you're coming out and you're trying to better your life, sometimes you don't want interaction with officials at all. You want to stay away. And so they are intimidated by that process. So I did want to share that, you know, there's a lot of celebration and fanfare around Executive Order number 7. And again, the NAACP was critical in essential, I shouldn't say essential, but we played a big role in getting that passed, as did other groups, the ACLU for one, and then toward the end, we did have some protesters from 2020 that joined with the push for that. So that's awesome. But I also want to acknowledge that the NAACP didn't stop there. We were also involved in the first executive order that allowed it to happen as well. But we didn't stop there. We went on, and again, I mentioned we worked with the Secretary of State's office to make sure that they had this information up on their site so that when people do come to find out about voting, that it is clear and people understand that they are able to vote. But we also worked with the Iowa Supreme Court. And what we did was we made a recommendation that the court accepted. And so now there is a supervisory order. It's called a supervisory order from the Iowa Supreme Court that people who are affected, basically who have gotten their citizens' rights back by Executive Order number 7, they also are now eligible for jury duty. And that's a big deal because because Vilsack had previously allowed people with felony backgrounds to vote, there were a number of them that were already able to vote. Well, with the Reynolds order, I mentioned this 45,000, probably a little bit more, being allowed to vote, but the total amount was affected by this jury duty, and that was 160,000 people now eligible to serve on juries. Why is that important? Number one, in our state, African Americans are 25% of the prison population, which is horrible, but it makes a difference because when you're on a jury, if there is just one black person in the pool, the jury becomes more fair. Not biased, just more fair. And that matters, and that will affect how people are convicted and sentenced, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a huge deal for 160,000 Iowans, and that was a victory that the NAACP got back in February of this year. So just kind of a lot of people think about that voting piece, but they don't know the other things. So we keep working. We keep working. Was there a hand over here?
I think there was one more over here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
No, I was just stretching.
Oh, okay. Yes, ma'am.
I think a lot of people don't know that everybody with a felony record and had served time was guilty, that many of them never went to court. Somebody was intimidated into saying, hey, they're going to convict you anyway. If you plead for this, you won't be in prison so long.
Yes, so everyone who is convicted wasn't necessarily guilty, is what you're saying. Yeah, that's highly likely. According to the Innocence Project, that's highly likely. And so, and of course, I mean, as quite frankly, in the African American community, we see that a lot. African Americans are, they may be guilty of one crime, but they're charged with a higher crime so that they have to plead down. And what that ends up doing is affecting that rate. So yes, there are a lot of circumstances around what's happening in the criminal justice system. And those are the kind of things that we talk about at the Iowa Summit on Justice and Disparities and at Mr. Hayes' summit as well. Oh, I know. When I saw you, I was like, okay.
Betty, thank you again.
Absolutely.
Let's give Betty another warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Eat our cookies on the way out, please.
Eat cookies. Eat cookies. I love it. It's fucking like